Hey guys, I want to welcome everybody tonight as we continue our series in Exodus. I hope everyone's doing well. We should make an announcement later this week on when we'll start meeting again. But tonight we're going to continue with the live stream and we're going to cover chapter 10 and chapter 11. And even though we're covering two chapters, it probably won't take us that long because chapter 11 is short and we're not covering as much content as we did last week. So backing up to last week, if you want to look over here at this list of the 10 plagues, we covered plagues 2 through 7 or sign 3 through 8, which began with the frogs, which was the last sign that the magicians were able to duplicate, all the way through the gnats or the lice, through the flies, through the disease on the livestock, through the boils, all the way to the hail and lightning, okay, or you could say storms that would accompany it. So we've seen those plagues, and I want you to remember the pattern of triad, where you have the first, fourth, and seventh that are similar in their literary design, where you have each of them beginning with an outdoor morning confrontation with Pharaoh. And then you have the second cycle or triad, which are plagues 2, 5, and 8, where you have an indoor or court confrontation with Pharaoh. We're going to see that the eighth is a little bit unique in that there's some added things in what we'll see with the negotiations between Moses and Pharaoh. But for the most part, the literary pattern or layout in the narrative is very similar. And then we'll see the ninth plague as well, which is the third plague in the third triad, which the third, sixth, and ninth, were unannounced. They just plagues that happen. And so we're going to cover the last two before we get to the one that kind of stands alone, which is the death of the firstborn. So let me pull those plagues up again. Did I? Okay, there we go. Hopefully, I created a new layout because we've been having issues with Logos kind of freezing up and closing itself. But we're going to focus on the eighth and the ninth plague, or more appropriately, as we'll see in this chapter, the signs. That's what they are called the majority of the time. They are signs, and we'll see right away what these signs function as they've been mentioned all the way throughout the plague narrative. So we're going to see the locust and the darkness. Okay, so chapter 10 in verse 1, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Go in unto Pharaoh, for I have hardened," the word hardened there is made heavy, kaved, "I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I might show these my signs," notice he uses that word signs, otot, "before him." And so he's continuing to reveal his sovereignty over Egypt, over Pharaoh, over the magicians. They're totally out of the picture at this point. They've been judged in the prior plague, and we won't see them anymore. So Yahweh continues to show that he is the supreme God, that he is the creator. And as I mentioned earlier on in these plagues, a lot of these plagues that we see are related to creation. There are a lot of the words. Now, we miss a lot of this in English, unfortunately, but a lot of the words that we see in these plagues are words that appeared in the creation story. And a lot of what we're seeing here in the judgment are creation reversals. In other words, these plagues are working against what creation was to bring about, and that was life. And so we see death that is working in these situations as a result of the hardness of Pharaoh and the bondage and oppression that has been going on against the Hebrew people. So he's continuing to show his signs. Verse 2, "And that you may tell in the ears of your son and of your son's son, what I have wrought. Notice that what I have wrought is highlighted, and that actually means um, it's a verb here, halal. It's used 18 times in the entire Hebrew Old Testament, and it means deal severely with. And so he's saying part of the reason why he is bringing these judgments is that the Hebrew people will be able to tell their children and their grandchildren in times to come about how God dealt severely with Egypt. And why that's important is because you had over 400 years of oppression, slavery, that finally justice is coming. And if you guys remember, I pointed out that there were entire generations, many generations, that lived and died having spent their entire life in bondage, in slavery, in oppression. And so finally the time has come for there to be deliverance. And that's why the book of Revelation picks up these plagues and uses them in the apocalypse that we see in Revelation, because the purpose of Revelation is to encourage persecuted Christians that are facing severe injustice to endure, to love not their lives to death, even though they may be part of a generation that faces martyrdom, or whatever we could envision as the worst to be expected in this life. If we're just faithful, in the end, Babylon will be judged. In the end, Egypt will be judged. Egypt, I told you guys last week, is a paradigm or archetype of the world system. It appears that the world wins, right? The world triumphs over the saints, as we see in the book of Revelation. Egypt has prevailed over the Hebrew people for generations. And you have to think that the Hebrew people in the middle of these circumstances are thinking there's no end in sight. This is the way it's always going to be. And indeed, for many it was. But at some point, God says, I'm going to step on the scene, and my power will not be restrained, and I will pour out my judgment on the beast system, on Egypt, on Babylon, on Rome, on the United States of America. And ultimately, God will bring vindication. And that's exactly what's happening here. And that vindication will end in deliverance, salvation. And so we have types and shadows and archetypes that are being shown to us right here in this Exodus story. And so he says, you will show your children and your grandchildren the things that I have wrought, how I have dealt harshly with Egypt, my signs which I have done among them, that you may know how that I am Yahweh. And so we see that aspect of the Lord really focusing on revealing the greatness and the power of his name, as we seen back in chapter 3 and chapter 6, especially in chapter 6, where he says that the patriarchs didn't know the fullness of the name Yahweh. But the Israelites are going to know all about the fullness of what Yahweh means, and that he is the Lord, the creator over all. And we're going to see that, and we have been seeing that in his judgment over Egypt, Pharaoh, and the gods of Egypt. I haven't spent a lot of time focusing on the fact that a lot of these plagues are polemical against the gods that were worshipped in Egypt. But there are aspects of every single plague that the Egyptians themselves would have seen as judgment against deities that they had worshipped. So this is shaking and rocking their faith, as we'll especially see in these two plagues tonight. And so, again, he is continuing to show that he's Yahweh, the creator, the sovereign Lord of all, the Lord of the universe. In verse 3 it says, And Moses and Aaron came in unto Pharaoh and said unto him, Thus says Yahweh, God of the Hebrews, How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? What's interesting is God already answered that back in chapter 4. He told him the last plague would be the death of the firstborn. So we know that, right? He says, let my people go that they may serve me. And God's purpose in the Exodus, the deliverance, is that the Israelites will go from being slaves of Egypt, or you could say it this way to modernize it or to make it applicable, slaves to the world, into being slaves unto himself. Okay? So they're freed, they're redeemed or ransomed from the slavery to Egypt, which represents the world, but in that enslavement or that freedom, there's an enslavement to Yahweh. So they're just going to change who they are servants unto. The difference being, Yahweh is not harsh. He is not oppressive. He is just. He is righteous. He is holy. You could say it this way, he's worth working for. Unlike Egypt, we've seen Egypt has just continually put burdens upon them that are unjust, unfulfillable. And God's not that way. Well, he's not that way if you actually want to serve him. Right? So, verse 4, he says, else, if you refuse to let my people go, behold, tomorrow will I bring the locusts into the coast, or the borders. And so he tells him, this is what's going to happen. If you do not let the Hebrew people go so they can worship Yahweh, here's what's going to happen. Locusts are going to come into your coast. And locusts, if you'll look at the screen, is what we would primarily call grasshoppers, right? And here's an interesting thing about grasshoppers. In 1 square kilometer, right? Everywhere else in the world, they measure in kilometers for the most part, except here. In 1 square kilometer, there can be as many as 50 million of these insects in 1 square kilometer. 50 million. And just to give you an idea of how much damage they can do, in one night, 50 million of these insects in 1 square kilometer can eat or devour 100,000 tons of vegetation. That's mind-boggling. Okay? And so this is a serious, serious threat to their agrarian culture, right? And that's not only going to affect their agriculture, but it's going to affect what? Their economy. Which is going to affect what? Their superpower ability, right? Egypt is a superpower of the day, but they're going to be crippled in every way possible. Selah, right? Verse 5, he says, and they shall cover the face of the earth, or the ground more appropriately. Eretz can function either as earth or ground. That one cannot be able to see the ground. And they shall eat the residue of that which escaped, which remains unto you from the hail. Remember, hail was the last one that we covered last week. And shall eat every tree which grows for you for you out of the field. And again, a lot of what's being said here is obscured in the English, but see this word grows here, it's samach. That is a word that is not used a ton in the Hebrew Old Testament, but it's used in the creation story. A lot of these terms are, they've just chosen different English words from Genesis in the creation story to what we see here in Exodus. But it has overtones of the creation story, and here we see the reversal, right? Judgment against creation. And so verse 6 says, and they shall fill your houses and all the houses of all your servants and the houses of all the Egyptians, which neither your fathers nor your fathers' fathers have seen since the day they were upon the earth unto this day. It's interesting the way it's said there in verse 6, because earlier he said, I'm doing what I'm doing so that you can tell your children and your children's children. And here he said, I'm going to bring a judgment that neither your father nor your grandfathers have seen, which is a euphemistic way of saying it's going to be the worst thing you've ever seen. Nothing has occurred like it. And that's what's going to happen if Pharaoh does not comply and allow the Israelites to go out into the wilderness to worship Yahweh. And so it says, and he turned himself and went out from Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's servants said unto him, how long shall this man be a snare unto us? So at this point, we see that Moses is starting to shake those that surround Pharaoh. And for them to speak up to the most powerful man in Egypt was risky. It could cost them their life, which shows you the level of frustration that is beginning to surface from within Egypt, the servants of Pharaoh, insomuch that they're speaking to Pharaoh in a way that is, causing their lives to be in peril. And so it shows you the toll and the effect of the plagues. If we were to go back through them and just envision ourselves living through each of these plagues as we've read, it would be extremely, extremely frustrating. And so you could see why they would finally speak up, because at this point they probably think, man, what do we have to lose? I mean, everything's being destroyed. Everything's being lost. And they say, how long will this man be a snare unto us? Let the men go, that they may serve Yahweh their God. Do you not know that Egypt is destroyed? So they're really speaking out in a bold way, and they're ready to let the slaves go, which is, it speaks of their frustration, because if they let the slaves go, guess what happens? Slaves have to take their place. And if all the Hebrew slaves are gone, guess who that's going to be? The Egyptians themselves. And so they would rather be slaves than continue to endure the plagues that have been poured out on them. And so verse 8, and Moses and Aaron were brought again unto Pharaoh, and he said unto them, go, serve Yahweh your God. But who are they that shall go? And we've seen this vacillating in Pharaoh, where he said, I'll let you go. Then he changes his mind. Now, part of him is like, okay, go serve Yahweh your God. But who's going to go? And Moses said, we will go with our young, with our old, with our sons, with our daughters, with our flocks, and with our herds will we go. For we must hold a feast unto Yahweh. And so Moses is not backing up one bit from what they have demanded from day one. Let everyone go. Everyone who is Hebrew, and all of their possessions, all of their livestock, all of their belongings will go with them. Now we've already seen before this that Pharaoh, he don't mind if the men go, because if the men go and the children and the women stay, and obviously the livestock stay, guess what will happen? They'll come back. And that's what Pharaoh wants. He's willing to kind of comply, right? Kind of obey. We'll do it on my terms. That'll suffice Yahweh, right? He's the forgiving sort. He won't mind if, we fudge a little bit and, halfway obey him. There's a lot of people who identify as Christians but live like Pharaoh. They obey partially or where they want to, but they don't go all the way and obey Yahweh as he deserves. And that's what's puzzling, is when Yahweh reveals himself as the creator, the self-existent one, the one who was and is to come, who exists in and of himself, who is the creator of anything that lives, who is the creator and giver of life, whom without none of us have existence, how could we not want to obey him? How could we not want to submit to him as the sovereign ruler and Lord of the universe? How could we ever think that we have a better idea of what we should do in life? Well, Pharaoh, who is the personification of the world system, thinks he has a better way. He's not willing to obey Yahweh. So he's paying the price. In verse 9, and Moses said, we will go with our young, with our old, with our sons, with our daughters, with our flocks, our herds will we go. For we must hold a feast unto Yahweh. And he said unto them, let Yahweh be so with you as I will let you go, and your little ones. Look to it, for evil is before you. He's being sarcastic here. It's more noticeable when you read it in the original, but watch what he says in verse 11. This makes it clear. Not so. It's kind of, in English, it would be kind of like the sarcastic way of, yeah, go ahead, sure thing, you know. You and your little ones, you just go right to it. But he says, no, evil is before you. Not so. Go now, ye that are men, and serve the Lord. For that ye did desire. And so he's wanting to compromise again. He's saying, no, the men can go, but that's it. And they were driven out from Pharaoh's presence. So again, he's being stubborn. He's hardened his heart. And will not let them go. In verse 12, and Yahweh said unto Moses, stretch out your hand over the land of Egypt. Obviously, if he stretches out his hand, he would have the rod as well. Over Egypt for the locusts, that they may come upon the land of Egypt and eat every herb of the land. That's, again, herb there is a term that is borrowed from the creation story, Esev, which means basically any green living thing of the land, even all that the hail hath left. And Moses stretched forth his rod over the land of Egypt, and Yahweh brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night, and when it was morning, the east wind brought the locust. Now, it has been suspected that this is actually a wind from the Sahara Desert, from Africa, that would have blown these locusts in to the coast of Egypt. In verse 14 says, and the locust went up over all the land of Egypt and rested in all the coast of Egypt. Very grievous were they. Before them there were not so much locusts as they, neither after them shall be such. In other words, he's saying this is the worst plague of locusts there has ever been. And if you actually go and study about locusts or grasshoppers, they are a known nuisance in that part of the world throughout history. There are things etched in stone, even in Egypt, that speak of at times where they have dealt with an overabundance of these locusts. But this was the worst one. For they covered the face of the whole ground so that the land was darkened, which is going to kind of foreshadow what the next plague will be, which is darkness. And they did eat every herb of the land and all the fruit of the trees which the hail had left. And there remained not any green thing in the trees or in the herbs of the field throughout all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in haste, and he said, now watch what he says here in verse 16. Okay, I want you to pay attention to this, and I'll try not to be too sarcastic. But verse 16, then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in haste, and he said, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now, he's confessed his sin. he has confessed that Yahweh is the creator, right? He uses the divine name. He confessed the divine name of Yahweh, right? He confessed with his mouth. He believes in his heart. So he's a good covenant. How should I say it in Old Testament terms? He's righteous, right? He's in right standing with God. He's going to have eternal life because he's confessed the name of Yahweh, which was the name above all names in the Old Testament. He's confessed his sin, right? I've sinned against Yahweh and against you, Moses, the one whom Yahweh has sent. And so that would make him, to use terms that would be applicable to us, he's a Christian, right? He's acknowledged the name of the Lord. He's confessed his sins, right? Ask, believe, confess. And you have your magic ticket into the kingdom. Well, let's keep reading. According to Western soteriology, he'd be in the kingdom, but let's see how the story unfolds. Verse 17, now therefore forgive, I pray thee, my sin only this once. You mean he might have a motive? You mean the only reason he confesses the Lord's name and confesses that he sinned is because he wants to escape judgment? It's not because he wants to submit and obey Yahweh? You mean he just doesn't want to be punished? He doesn't want to be judged. It's not that he wants to serve Yahweh. He doesn't want to do what Yahweh has asked, but he doesn't want to pay the price for not doing it. It's the same problem we face today. Nothing has changed. There's nothing new under the sun. He wants to partially obey. Now, there's no doubt he believes that Yahweh is a real force to be reckoned with, and that he is exercising authority and power over the gods of Egypt that he had worshipped his whole life. There's no doubt. But he's not willing to sell out. He's not willing to submit to Yahweh. And that's what Yahweh's looking for in everyone. Throughout the Old Testament, Yahweh just wanted a people that would trust, believe, and obey. It's that simple. No, he don't want to. He says, forgive, I pray, my sin only this once, and entreat or intercede the Lord your God, that he may take away from me this death only. Again, we see his motive for asking, believing, and confessing. Right? He don't want to face death. He don't want to be destroyed. He don't want to be judged. Or you could say it this way, in the Christian reality, he don't want to go to hell. He don't love God. He don't want to obey God. He just don't want to die. And that's the same mindset that many people in Western Christianity have. They go to church, they'll mention the name of Jesus. They'll partially obey when it's convenient, when it's easy, when it doesn't put them out, doesn't put any pressure on them. And in the end, they just really don't want to go to hell, right? The thought of going to hell is just not too appealing. So, of course, they're going to ask, believe, and confess, but they don't obey. And they somehow have convinced themselves there's going to be a different outcome in the end than what we're going to see for Pharaoh. But the Bible is consistent in what can be expected because God never changes, right? Jesus never changes either. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so we see motives have everything to do with who's in and who's out of the kingdom. He just don't want to be judged. In verse 18, and he went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord. So he goes out and he intercedes. And verse 19 says, and Yahweh turned a mighty strong west wind, which took away the locusts and cast them into the Red Sea. There remained not one locust in all the coast of Egypt. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would not let the children of Israel go. And again, this is not God usurping sovereignty over the will of Pharaoh, because Pharaoh is said to harden his own heart. It's just the fact that every time Yahweh brings a plague, it causes Pharaoh to respond by hardening his heart, because he doesn't want to let the children of Israel go. Verse 21. And Yahweh said unto Moses, stretch your hand toward heaven. Here we see the ninth plague, and it's unannounced, no confrontation. God says, all right, let's just move right into the ninth plague. And this is going to complete the cycle of the third triad. So he said, stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt. And in the Hebrew it actually says a darkness that would cause groping. In other words, where that Hebrew word groping is to kind of be feeling around. It's so dark, it's just impenetrable, right? You're just feeling around because you can't see anything. In verse 22 it says, and Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. And that is what's bizarre about this. And that's what makes it difficult for those who adhere to natural phenomena only rationale for these plagues. Because it couldn't be an eclipse, because where the Israelites were encamped and where the Egyptians were is not very far, right? So it can't be an eclipse. And to be honest, I don't know a satisfactory answer. I mean, there are a lot of hypotheses, like it was a sandstorm or something of that nature, but how could the sandstorm, which is driven by wind, not affect the Israelites who are, right next door? It doesn't work. This is some supernatural event that I don't know what was going on there, but I know what the text says. It was a darkness that caused them to be unable to see, to come and go for 3 days, but there was light in the dwellings of the children of Israel. Now, what we don't understand, because we live in the age of electricity, is how disabling darkness would have been for them to last 3 days. 3 days of nothing but darkness. I mean, you think about the psychological toll that it would have taken on them. You can't prepare food. You can't see anything. Just total darkness for 3 days. It'd be like being locked up in a padded cell, in prison with nothing. You can't see anything. And not only that, I mean, this is the ninth plague, right? They're getting wore out already. Everything's been destroyed pretty much. They have been annoyed by all kinds of insects and frogs and having to dig for water and sickness, and they've just had one thing after another. They're at wit's end already. And now they can't see nothing. They can't do anything. This would have been devastating for them. But in Goshen, the Israelites have light in their dwellings. And Pharaoh called unto Moses and said, go ye, serve Yahweh. Only let your flocks and your herds be stayed. Let your little ones also go with you. So he's willing to fudge a little bit more, right? A little bit more judgment. I'll go a little bit further. I'll obey a little bit closer to what God's asking for, right? The little ones can go, but you got to leave your flocks and your herds here. Well, the problem with that is you can't really worship without flocks and herds, because it's kind of hard to commit animal sacrifices without them, right? So they wouldn't be able to worship or serve Yahweh. Plus, they would need them if they never planned on coming back, which is obviously what they had planned. In verse 25, please don't. It froze for a second. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so verse 25, here's Moses' response. And Moses said, Moses said nothing. I'm beginning to think that this may be a power consumption issue with everything that I have going here and all these screens that are working off of it and stuff. There's not enough power. I don't know. Sorry guys, I'm talking out loud. I'm troubleshooting. Y'all probably wondering who I'm talking to. It's Gary. Okay, I'm going to slow down here. And which is hard for me to do. Why does it do that? Crazy thing. Must have num lock on. Talking to myself again. Okay. So Moses said, "You must give us also sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may sacrifice unto Yahweh our God. Our cattle, or more appropriately our livestock, mikneh, shall also go with us. There shall not a hoof be left behind. For therefore must we take to serve the Lord our God. And we know not with what we must serve the Lord until we come there." And so Moses says, no, we're going to take everything we have with us. There's not a hoof that will be left behind. Everything goes. Because we don't know exactly at this point what all Yahweh will require from us. You have to remember, at this point, they haven't received the Torah. They haven't received the commandments for the priesthood or the sacrifices, even though they would have been familiar with the fact there have been sacrifices throughout human history, as we see going back to the Cain and Abel story. There were definitive laws. Those would begin to be given at Sinai. And so verse 27 says, "But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. And Pharaoh said unto him, Get from me, take heed to yourself, see my face no more." Which is kind of ironic, because he won't. "For in the day that you see my face, you shall die." So Pharaoh's fed up. He's like, "I am sick of you and your plagues. If you don't get out of here, and if I see you again, you're going to die." And he's going to get what he asked for. He's not going to have another conversation with Moses. And so Moses responds in verse 29. Moses said, "You have spoken well. I will see your face again no more." Be careful what you ask for, Pharaoh, because we're going to see that the 10th and final plague is going to be what causes Pharaoh to release the Israelites. So we're having a total meltdown here. I'm not sure what's going on, to be honest with you. At least you're at home in your pajamas and you got your snacks and you could take a bathroom break or something. Usually when it gets in a sequence of doing this over and over, it doesn't stop for some reason. If we can just get to chapter 11, there's not that many verses, and we should be able to cover the most of it without scrolling too much. Hopefully. Okay. Chapter 11. What we're going to see here in chapter 11 is going to be a setup. It's going to be a conversation between Yahweh and Moses. And it's going to set us up for the 10th and final plague. And I'm really looking forward to chapter 12, which is why I wanted to go through chapter 10 and 11 tonight, because it'll probably take us 2 weeks to go through chapter 12, because in chapter 12, something very important and very much overlooked happens, in that Yahweh is going to introduce what I have called, and you guys should be familiar with it that have followed the teaching here, is the redemptive calendar of Yahweh. It is a calendar which changes what was a calendar that began in the fall to beginning in the spring, and it was a calendar that cycled and centered around specific harvest, but it was in connection with redemption, as we'll see and explain in chapter 12. So there is so much importance there that we'll bring out in chapter 12, and how that relates to what Christ has accomplished and will accomplish in fulfilling those particular feast or appointed times. So we'll talk more about that next week, but this will set us up to do that. In verse 1 it says, "And Yahweh said unto Moses, Yet will I bring one plague more upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt, and afterwards he will let you go hence. When he shall let you go, he shall surely thrust you out hence altogether." In other words, he says, when I bring this plague to pass, he's going to be more than willing and actually forceful in demanding that you go. So verse 2, he says, "Speak now in the ears of the people, and let every man borrow." It says borrow here, but please don't do it. The Hebrew word is actually a word that means ask. Dadgummit. I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to finish up an olive tree, because it isn't quite as demanding on my CPU. Okay. Verse 2. "Speak now in the ears of the people, and let every man borrow of his neighbor, or ask of his neighbor, and every woman of her neighbor, jewels of silver and jewels of gold." And this is obviously asking from the Egyptians. "And Yahweh gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. So Moses has made his mark being in Egypt, and he has gained favor with even many of the Egyptians. And Moses said, "Thus says Yahweh, about midnight," or in the middle of the night, "will I go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sits upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill. So from the palace to the servants, everyone will be affected. And not only that, and all the firstborn of beasts." So all of the firstborn in Egypt will die overnight. And verse 6 says, "And there will be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there was none like it, nor shall be like it anymore." So this is going to be very unique in the death of the firstborn of their livestock and the Egyptians. Now, a lot of people say that this is unjust on God's part, that he would bring judgment on innocent, what is said to be innocent victims. But this is an instance where we see the wages of sin is death, and there are consequences for sin in a fallen world that affects not only yourself but others. And sometimes in the midst of that judgment, those that have done no wrong are affected by the wrong that has been done. And that's not unjust, that God would recompense judgment on the firstborn of the Egyptians, because there's a lot of retribution in that, because the first, the male children of the Israelites were thrown in the Nile. And so, it's kind of measure for measure. And we tend to focus on this life, okay? We don't think bigger picture. We don't think eternally. We think finite, right? And we say, oh, it's unjust that the Hebrew children would be judged and killed overnight. Well, actually not. It's actually the mercy of God. Let me explain. If they weren't killed, most likely they would have grown up in a polytheistic environment, and they would have died having never known the true and living God. But in the judgment of God on the firstborn, even though they were without sin, right? They're children, they're innocent. They lose their lives on this earth, but they're not eternally damned. Whereas had not God taken their lives in judgment against Egypt, they probably would have grown up their entire lives. Maybe they lived a full life, but in the end they perished. So which is better? Living your life as an Egyptian for 70 years and then perishing forever, or really not having had a very long life here on this earth, 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever the firstborn's age were, and then to die. But because you're innocent, you're with the Creator. You meet the one who is bringing about the plagues that you've seen and experienced. So tell me which is better. The answer is obvious from an infinite perspective. But again, we live in a world where we concentrate on what we see, feel, and know right now. We think temporally and not eternally. Verse 7, "But against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog move his tongue against man or beast, that you may know how the Lord does put a difference between the Egyptians and Israel." So what's he saying here? That the Israelites are not going to be affected. But what is said here is that a dog shall not move his tongue. What does that mean? Well, in ancient culture, they weren't very high on dogs. Matter of fact, dogs were kind of like rats today. They were scavengers. They weren't as domesticated. They weren't living in homes. They lived around the city where they could find scraps or anything else to sustain themselves. And what's in view here in verse 7 is the fact that the dogs will not have access to corpses of Israelites like they will the Egyptians. And we've seen stories in the Old Testament where the dogs will eat the deceased. And that's what's in view here, that there will be no deceased in Israel, because the Lord has put a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. But as far as the Egyptians are concerned, they will have plenty of fatalities. Verse 8, and all of these thy servants shall come down unto me, shall bow down themselves unto me, saying, Get out, all the people that follow you, and after that I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in a great anger. And the Lord said unto Moses, Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you, that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. And Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh. This is kind of a summary here. And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would not let the children of Israel go out of his land. Now, something that I forgot to mention a while ago because my system was messing up there, is in the plague of darkness, not only would you have the darkness to deal with, right, for 3 days, but you would also have the Egyptians viewing that as the defeat of their highest god, which was the sun god. When you study the Egyptian culture, you'll see that they had the sun god Re or Ra. It's said both ways depending on what you're looking at. But that was the sun god. And when they didn't see their god for 3 days, they would have seen that as defeat. Because, they had myths of how that each day he would defeat the demon, I can't remember the demon's name, Apophis, of darkness, and the sun would rise. And so to them it would have looked like darkness prevailed. And their highest deity was no more, because never had there been darkness for 3 days straight. So you could see the reason why they're so frustrated and acting the way they are, and they want the Israelites out. But what we've seen here in chapter 11 is going to set us up for chapter 12, the 10th and final plague, the 11th sign. And it's a long chapter, so again, I doubt that we'll get all the way through chapter 12 next time. So I encourage you to read ahead in chapter 12, and I'll put some other scriptures that you can cross-reference with to better understand chapter 12 in the Facebook group. But until next week, I hope everyone's doing well. Again, we'll make an announcement on when we'll resume services and what that will look like and what that will entail. So until then, I'll see you guys later. Have a good evening.